Kian slammed the diner door open before Mara could reach it, and lightning cracked across the sky like a warning. She spun around, her heart jumping, expecting a fallen sign or a stray dog. Instead, a boy stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, his lips trembling from cold, his eyes wide with something that looked like fear mixed with hunger. "We're closed," Mara said, though the words felt wrong the moment they left her mouth. The boy did not move. He stood there, rain dripping from his hair onto the floor, his thin arms wrapped around himself. He looked no older than 12, but there was something in the way he held his body, alert and careful, that made him seem older than his years. "Please," he said, his voice cracking, "I haven't eaten in 2 days." Mara Ellison had run the small roadside diner on Route 9 for almost 6 years, ever since her father passed it down to her. She had seen drifters before, tired truckers, lost tourists, even a runaway teenager once, who she'd quietly called the sheriff for. But something about this boy made her pause. He wasn't just cold and hungry. He was watching the road behind him like he expected something terrible to come around the bend. "Get in here before you catch your death," she said, stepping aside. The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder one more time, then slipped inside. Mara closed the door and threw the lock, more out of habit than any real fear. The diner was empty this late, just the hum of the refrigerator and the soft patter of rain against the windows. She grabbed a towel from behind the counter and tossed it to him. "What's your name?" "Kian," he said, wrapping the towel around his shoulders. "Just Kian?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes moved across the diner, taking in every corner, every shadow, the way someone does when they are used to checking for danger. Mara noticed it but said nothing. She walked behind the counter and pulled out a plate, scooping the last of the evening's stew into a bowl, along with 2 thick slices of bread. "Sit," she said, nodding toward the booth closest to the kitchen. "Eat slow. You'll make yourself sick if you rush it." Kian slid into the booth like his legs had given up holding him. When the bowl landed in front of him, his hands shook as he picked up the spoon. He ate carefully at first, then faster, like his body had stopped listening to his mind. Mara watched from behind the counter, arms crossed, feeling a strange tightness in her chest. "Where are your parents?" she asked gently. The spoon paused halfway to his mouth. "My mother isn't around anymore." "And your father?" Something flickered across his face, quick and sharp, like a shadow passing over water. "He's busy," Kian said, and the way he said it told Mara there was an entire story hiding behind those 2 words. She decided not to push. Not yet. "You live near here?" "Not far," Kian said, which told her nothing at all. Outside, the storm rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, a low rumble rolled across the sky that wasn't quite thunder. Kian's head snapped toward the sound, his whole body going still, like a rabbit that had just heard the snap of a twig. Mara followed his gaze but saw nothing, except rain and darkness. "You okay?" "Fine," he said too quickly, and went back to eating, though his shoulders stayed tense. Mara had grown up around this stretch of forest her entire life. She knew the stories the old-timers told about the land beyond the ridge, the place everyone in town simply called the Hollow. Nobody hunted there. Nobody hiked there. Even the hardiest truckers avoided the back road that curled along its edge, especially after dark. As a child, Mara had been warned to never wander past the tree line, though no one could ever tell her exactly why. It was just something everyone accepted, the way people accept that fire is hot and ice is cold. She wondered, watching Kian's nervous glances toward the window, if he had come from that direction. "Do you go to school around here?" she asked, trying a different angle. Kian shook his head. "I learn other things." "Like what?" He looked up at her then, and for a moment, his eyes held something ancient and tired, something that did not belong on the face of a child. "Things that keep me alive," he said quietly, and went back to his bread. Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what kind of childhood could put that look in a boy's eyes, but something told her that pushing too hard, too fast, would make him bolt out into the rain and never come back. So instead, she poured him a glass of milk and set it down without a word. "Thank you," Kian said, and this time his voice sounded almost surprised, as though kindness itself was unfamiliar to him. They sat in silence for a while, the boy eating, Mara wiping down the counter that didn't need wiping, both of them listening to the storm rage outside. Every few minutes, Kian's eyes would drift to the door, then to the window, then back to his food, an endless cycle of watching and eating, watching and eating. "You can stay until the rain stops," Mara offered. "I'll close up, but you don't have to leave in this." "I have to leave before midnight," Kian said, glancing at the old clock on the wall. It read 10:15. "He'll notice if I'm gone too long." "Who will?" Kian's jaw tightened, and he looked down at his empty bowl. "Nobody," he mumbled, though the fear in his voice said otherwise. Mara leaned against the counter, studying him. There was something about the boy that unsettled her and pulled at her heart in equal measure. He was clearly starving, clearly frightened, and clearly hiding something enormous, something too big for a child to carry alone. She thought of the missing hikers the local paper had reported last spring, 3 of them, never found. The case quietly closed without much explanation. She thought of the strange howls people swore they heard some nights near the ridge, dismissed by most as coyotes, though coyotes had never sounded quite like that in her lifetime. "You said you learned things that keep you alive," Mara said carefully. "What kind of things are dangerous enough that a boy your age needs to learn how to survive them?" Kian looked at her for a long moment, and she thought, just for a second, that he might actually answer. His mouth opened slightly, the words forming somewhere behind his teeth. Then the wind outside howled with sudden force, rattling the windows so hard that the salt shakers on the tables trembled, and Kian flinched like he'd been struck. "I should go," he said, standing abruptly. "It's still pouring," Mara said. "You'll freeze." "I have to." He was already moving toward the door, the towel slipping from his shoulders onto the floor. Mara hurried after him, catching his arm gently before he could reach the handle. "Wait. At least take this." She grabbed a paper bag from behind the counter, quickly filling it with 2 more slices of bread and an apple from the small basket near the register. She pressed it into his hands. "For later." Kian stared at the bag like he didn't know what to do with unexpected kindness. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you're a hungry kid who walked in here soaked and scared," Mara said simply. "That's reason enough." Something in his expression softened, just slightly, the wall around him cracking for the briefest moment. "Thank you," he said again, quieter this time, more genuine. Then he opened the door, and the storm swallowed him whole, his small figure disappearing into the darkness and the rain, before Mara could say another word. She stood in the doorway for a long time after he left, watching the empty road, the rain slanting sideways under the flickering streetlight. Something about the encounter left her unsettled, in a way she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just the boy's hunger, or his fear. It was the way he spoke about his father, the way the word itself seemed to carry weight, danger, and something close to reverence all at once. She locked up the diner that night thinking about him, and when she finally lay down in her small apartment above the shop, sleep did not come easily. She kept picturing his eyes, the way they darted toward the window every time the wind picked up, the way his shoulders had curled inward, as though bracing for a blow that never came. The next morning, she almost convinced herself it had been a strange dream, a trick of the storm and her tired mind. But when she opened the diner and found a single muddy footprint by the door, small, boy-sized, she knew it had been real. She thought about calling the sheriff, telling him about the strange, frightened child who had wandered in from the storm. But something held her back, some quiet instinct that told her this wasn't a matter for police reports or missing child forms. Whatever Kian was running from, whatever secret lived behind his careful eyes, it was bigger than anything a small-town sheriff could handle. All day, as she flipped eggs and poured coffee for the regulars, her mind kept drifting back to the boy. She found herself glancing at the door every time the bell above it rang, half hoping, half fearing that he would walk through it again. He didn't come that day, or the next. But on the 3rd evening, just as the sun dipped below the tree line and the diner emptied of its last customers, the bell above the door rang softly, and there he was again, thinner than before, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkening road behind him, as though something out there had followed him all the way to her door. "You came back," Mara said, relief washing over her before she could stop it. Kian nodded, stepping inside, his eyes finding hers with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something that looked almost like hope. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted. Mara's chest tightened. Whatever was happening in this boy's life, whatever forces were pulling at him from the shadows of that forbidden forest, she had a feeling she was about to become part of it, whether she wanted to or not. And as she reached for a clean bowl and ladled out the evening's soup, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the ridge, someone powerful was watching, and waiting, and wondering where the boy had gone. Kian returned 3 more times that week, always after sunset, always with the same nervous glance over his shoulder before stepping through the door. Mara began to notice a pattern in his visits, a careful rhythm that seemed less like coincidence and more like survival. He never stayed long. He never lingered past a certain hour, and he never, not once, let his guard down completely, even as he ate the meals she prepared for him with quiet, grateful hunger. On the 4th visit, she decided to pay closer attention. It started with small things. Kian could hear the delivery truck rumbling down the highway a full 2 minutes before Mara ever caught the sound, his head tilting slightly, as though tuning into a frequency she could not access. He flinched at sudden noises, but not in the way most people did. It was more precise, more controlled, like his body was constantly calculating risk and reward with every sound that reached his ears. Once, when a car backfired outside, Kian was on his feet and halfway to the back door before Mara even registered what had happened. He caught himself, embarrassed, and slipped back into the booth without a word, but his hands trembled around his glass of water for several minutes afterward. "You're always listening," Mara said one evening, sliding a plate of pancakes in front of him. It was well past dinner hours, but she'd started keeping breakfast food on hand, just in case he showed up, since he always seemed to prefer it. "You have to listen," Kian said simply, "if you want to keep living." Living where? Exactly. He didn't answer that question directly, the way he never answered anything directly, but his eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward the window that faced the dark tree line in the distance. Mara had noticed this happen every single time she asked him something that skirted too close to the truth. His gaze would drift toward the hollow, just for a heartbeat, before he caught himself and looked away. She began to piece together small fragments. He mentioned once, almost carelessly, that he wasn't allowed near the main house unless summoned. Another time, he referred to the pack before quickly changing the subject, his face flushing, as though he'd said something forbidden. Mara didn't know what to make of the word pack. It sounded almost like something out of an old folk tale, the kind of word her grandmother used to whisper about the deep woods when Mara was young and afraid of the dark. "Do you have brothers or sisters?" Mara asked one night, trying a gentler approach. "No," Kian said, "just me." "And your father? Is he strict?" Kian's fork paused over his plate. For a long moment, he said nothing, staring down at the syrup pooling around his pancakes like it held some kind of answer. "He has rules," Kian finally said. "Everyone has to follow them, even me. What happens if you don't follow them?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Kian's jaw tightened, and Mara noticed, for the first time, a faint mark along his collarbone that peeked out from beneath his shirt collar, something that looked like an old scar, pale and thin, half hidden by the fabric. "You don't want to know," he said quietly, and went back to eating. Mara wanted to press further, but the look on his face told her this was a door he wasn't ready to open, not yet. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, comfortable in its own strange way, filled only by the soft clink of his fork against the plate and the distant hum of the diner's old refrigerator. Over the following days, Mara began noticing more. Kian's clothes, though clean, were always the same few outfits, worn thin at the elbows and knees. His shoes had holes near the toes that let in rainwater, and he never seemed to have money, though he never asked for food outright either. He simply appeared, hungry and quiet, and waited to see if she would offer. She always did. One night, as a light drizzle tapped against the windows, Kian arrived looking more exhausted than usual, dark circles ringing his eyes, his movements slower, heavier. Mara set a plate in front of him without asking questions, watching as he ate mechanically, his mind clearly somewhere far away. "Rough day?" she asked gently. Kian gave a small, humorless laugh. "Rough life," he muttered, then seemed to catch himself, glancing up at her with something like alarm, as if he'd revealed too much. "You can talk to me," Mara said, sitting down across from him for the first time since he'd started visiting. "I'm not going to tell anyone anything. Whatever you say stays right here, between us. Kian studied her face for a long moment, searching for something, perhaps trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, at least a little, because his shoulders relaxed just slightly. There's a place, he said slowly, past the ridge, where I live. It's not like other places. The people there, they're different, stronger, faster. They follow one man, and whatever he says becomes law. He paused, staring at his hands. That man is my father. Mara's heart pounded, though she kept her face calm, encouraging him to continue. What's his name? Kian hesitated, glancing toward the window again, that same nervous habit resurfacing. Draven, he whispered, as though even saying the name too loudly might summon the man himself. Everyone calls him Alpha. He rules everything past the tree line, and everyone there answers to him, no matter what he asks. Even you? Especially me, Kian said, and something in his voice cracked, just slightly, revealing a depth of pain that made Mara's chest ache. I'm supposed to be strong like him. I'm supposed to lead one day, but I'm not what he wanted. I'm not fast enough, not strong enough, not enough of anything he needed me to be. So he punishes you for that. Kian didn't answer directly, but the silence that followed was answer enough. Mara reached across the table, hesitating only a moment, before placing her hand gently over his. You don't have to be anything you're not, she said softly. Not for him, not for anyone. Kian looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He clearly refused to let fall. You don't understand how it works there, he said. Everyone has a place. Everyone has a purpose. If you don't fit, you don't survive. You're surviving now, Mara pointed out. You found your way here. A small, sad smile touched the corner of Kian's mouth. This is the only place that feels different, he admitted. The only place I don't have to prove anything. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the rain tapping softly against the windows, the warmth of the diner wrapping around them like a blanket against the harshness of whatever world Kian had to return to once he stepped back outside. Mara found herself wanting to protect him, this strange, careful boy who spoke of his own father, with a mixture of fear and something that almost resembled longing, as if some small part of him still hoped his father might one day see him differently. Before he left that night, Kian paused at the door, turning back to look at her. Thank you for listening, he said. Nobody ever really listens. I'll always listen, Mara promised. Whenever you need to talk, or eat, or just sit somewhere warm, you come here. This door is always open for you. Kian nodded, a flicker of something like hope crossing his tired features, before he slipped back out into the night, disappearing down the dark road that curled toward the ridge, and whatever waited for him beyond it. Mara watched him go, her mind spinning with everything she'd just learned, the word Alpha echoing strangely in her thoughts. She didn't fully understand what kind of world Kian belonged to, what kind of power his father held over the land beyond the hollow, or why a boy so young carried scars both visible and hidden with such practiced silence. But she understood enough to know that Kian needed somewhere safe, someone steady, someone who wouldn't ask him to be anything other than exactly who he was. And as she closed up the diner that night, glancing once more toward the dark tree line in the distance, she made a silent promise to herself that she would be that person for him, no matter what dangers might be lurking in the shadows of the world he came from. The town of Millbrook was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, and word of the strange boy who visited Mara's diner after dark had begun to spread, whispered over coffee cups and grocery store counters, with the particular relish small towns reserve for anything out of the ordinary. You know, that forest past the ridge has always been strange, old Mr. Abernathy told Mara one afternoon, hunched over his usual stool at the counter, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow, deliberate circles. My father used to say there were families living out there who kept to themselves, generation after generation, never mixing with townfolk. Powerful families. Dangerous ones. Dangerous how? Mara asked, though she already suspected she knew more than Mr. Abernathy did. Nobody really knows, he said, shrugging his thin shoulders. But the hunting stopped out that way decades ago. Even the boldest hunters wouldn't go past a certain point. Said the woods themselves felt wrong, like something was always watching. Mara filed this away, alongside everything Kian had told her. Pieces of a puzzle, slowly forming a picture she still couldn't fully see. She thought about the scar on his collarbone, the way he flinched at sudden sounds, the reverence and fear tangled together whenever he spoke about his father. That evening, business was slow, just a few truckers scattered among the booths, nursing coffee and pie, before continuing their long drives through the night. Mara found herself glancing at the clock more often than usual, waiting. Kian arrived a little after 8, slipping through the door with his usual quiet caution, though tonight, something seemed different. His eyes carried a heaviness Mara hadn't seen before, and there was a slight limp in his step that made her chest tighten with worry. "What happened?" she asked immediately, guiding him to a booth in the back, away from the trucker's curious glances. "Nothing," Kian said too quickly, easing himself into the seat with obvious discomfort. Kian. He met her eyes, and whatever he saw in her expression seemed to break something loose inside him, because his shoulders slumped, and the careful mask he always wore slipped just slightly. "Training," he admitted. "It didn't go well today." "Training for what?" "For proving myself," he said bitterly. "There's a trial, coming up soon, something all the young ones have to go through when they reach a certain age. It shows everyone what you're capable of, what place you'll hold among the others. And you're worried about it?" Kian let out a shaky breath. "I'm terrified of it," he said. "Everyone expects me to fail. My father expects me to fail. And if I do—" He trailed off, staring down at the table. "If you do, what happens?" "I get sent away," Kian said quietly. "Somewhere far from everyone, somewhere I won't embarrass him anymore." Mara felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest, an anger she hadn't expected toward a man she had never even met. "That's not fair," she said. "You're just a child. Nobody should expect you to be perfect." "He's not just anyone," Kian said. "Everything he says becomes the way things are. Nobody questions him. Nobody dares to." "Somebody should," Mara said firmly. Kian looked up at her, something like alarm flickering across his features. "You can't," he said quickly. "Please, promise me you won't try to find him, or ask around about him, or anything like that. If he found out I was coming here, if he found out about you, what would happen?" Kian's silence was answer enough, heavy and frightening in its own way. Mara reached across the table and squeezed his hand gently. "I won't do anything to put you in danger," she promised, "but I want you to know that you don't have to face this trial believing you're going to fail. Whatever it is, whatever they're asking of you, you're stronger than you think." "You don't know that," Kian said softly. "I know that any boy who survives what you've survived, who keeps getting back up after everything that's been thrown at him, has more strength in him than most grown men I've ever met," Mara said firmly. "That kind of strength doesn't always look like what people expect. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's just refusing to give up." Something in Kian's expression shifted, softened, as though her words had settled somewhere deep inside him that desperately needed to hear them. "Nobody's ever said anything like that to me before," he admitted. "Well, get used to hearing it," Mara said, offering him a small smile. "Because I'm not going anywhere." They sat together for a while longer, Mara bringing him a bowl of warm soup that he ate slowly, methodically, his mind clearly still churning over the trial that awaited him. She wanted desperately to ask more, to understand exactly what this trial entailed, what dangers it might pose to a boy already carrying so many hidden wounds, but she could see the exhaustion pulling at him, and decided the questions could wait. Before he left that night, Kian paused at the door, as he often did, turning back to look at her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something almost like determination mixed with fear. "If something happens to me," he said quietly, "if I don't come back for a while, please don't worry. It just means I'm dealing with things I have to deal with." The words sent a chill through Mara's entire body. "Kian, if you're in danger, you need to tell me. I can help you. I can call someone, get you somewhere safe." "There's nowhere safer than where I already am," Kian interrupted. "This is my life, Mara. This is who I am. I just need you to trust me, and to be here when I need somewhere quiet to think." "I'll always be here," Mara said, though the promise felt inadequate against the weight of everything she still didn't understand. Kian nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his tired features before he slipped back out into the darkness, his small figure disappearing down the same shadowed road he always took toward the ridge. Mara stood at the window for a long time after he left, watching the empty road, her mind racing with worry. Over the following days, Kian did not return. Mara found herself checking the clock obsessively each evening, glancing toward the door every time the bell rang, hoping to see his familiar figure step through it. Days turned into a full week, and still there was no sign of him. She began to wonder if she should have pushed harder for answers, should have insisted on knowing more about the dangers he faced, should have done something, anything, to keep him from whatever trial awaited him beyond the ridge. She thought about driving out toward the hollow herself, following the road that curled into the dense trees where Kian always disappeared. But every instinct in her body told her that such an action would only bring danger crashing down on both of them. Whatever world Kian belonged to operated by its own rules, rules that clearly did not welcome outsiders, and clumsy interference from someone who didn't understand those rules could easily make everything worse. So she waited, filling the empty evenings with worry disguised as routine, wiping down counters that didn't need wiping, refilling napkin dispensers that were already full, glancing at the door every time the wind rattled the windows, hoping against hope that soon she would hear that familiar bell ring and see Kian's tired, careful eyes looking back at her once again. 10 days passed before Kian returned, and when he finally did, Mara nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding at the sight of him. He moved slowly through the door, favoring his right side, a fading bruise darkening the edge of his jaw and disappearing beneath his collar. His eyes, though, held something different than before, not quite pride, but something close to relief, as though a great weight had lifted, even as new burdens had settled onto his thin shoulders. "Kian," Mara breathed, setting down the pot and hurrying around the counter. "What happened to you?" "Where have you been?" "The trial," he said simply, easing himself into their usual booth with obvious care. "It's over now." "And?" "I survived," Kian said, though the words carried a strange weight, as though survival alone had been the only victory worth claiming. "Barely, but I survived." Mara studied his bruised face, the careful way he held his ribs, the exhaustion etched into every line of his young features. "This isn't right," she said, anger rising in her voice before she could stop it. "Whatever kind of trial does this to a child, it isn't right." "It's tradition," Kian said quietly. "It's how things have always been done." "That doesn't make it right," Mara insisted, moving to the small first aid kit she kept behind the counter. She returned with antiseptic and bandages, kneeling beside the booth to get a better look at the bruise along his jaw. "Does this happen every time? Every trial? Every test?" Kian was quiet for a long moment, watching her carefully clean the edge of the bruise with gentle, practiced movements. "It's supposed to make us stronger," he finally said. "Pain teaches lessons that comfort never can. That's what he always says." "Your father." Kian nodded, wincing slightly, as Mara dabbed antiseptic along a small cut near his eyebrow she hadn't noticed before. "He says a leader who's never been broken can never truly understand how to lead others through their own breaking points." "That sounds like an excuse," Mara said carefully, "for hurting someone who doesn't deserve it." "Maybe," Kian admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's the only world I know." Mara finished bandaging the small cut, then sat back on her heels, studying the boy in front of her with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. "You deserve better than this," she said firmly. "Whatever your father's traditions say, whatever the rules of your world demand, no child deserves to be hurt this badly, just to prove they're worthy of respect." Kian looked at her with an expression that seemed almost startled by her conviction, as though the idea itself was foreign to him, something he'd never considered possible. "You really believe that?" "I know that," Mara said, "and someday, I hope you believe it too." They sat together quietly after that, Mara bringing him a plate of warm food, watching him eat slowly, carefully, favoring the uninjured side of his jaw. She noticed new details as the evening wore on, small things that told her more than words ever could. His knuckles were scraped raw, his wrists carried faint marks that looked disturbingly like they'd been bound at some point, and there was a heaviness in his movements that spoke of exhaustion running far deeper than simple physical tiredness. "Did you pass?" Mara asked eventually, unable to hold back the question any longer. Kian's expression flickered, something complicated passing behind his eyes. "I didn't fail," he said carefully, "but I didn't impress anyone either. My father barely looked at me afterward." "That's his loss," Mara said firmly. "Not yours. You don't understand what it's like," Kian said, his voice cracking slightly. To spend your whole life trying to earn one person's approval, and never quite getting there, no matter how hard you try, no matter what you sacrifice. Mara's heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his words. She reached across the table and took his scraped hand gently in hers. "I understand more than you might think," she said softly. "My own father wasn't always easy to please either. He had his own ideas about how things should be done, how a diner should be run, how a daughter should behave. It took me years to realize that his approval wasn't something I needed to build my whole life around." "How did you stop needing it?" "I found people who valued me for exactly who I was," Mara said. "Not for what I could prove, or achieve, or become. Just for being myself." She squeezed his hand gently. "You're going to find that too, Kian. Maybe not from your father, but from somewhere. From someone." Kian's eyes glistened, and for the first time since she'd known him, a single tear slipped down his cheek, quickly wiped away with the back of his uninjured hand. "Sometimes I wonder what it would be like," he admitted quietly, "to just be normal, to not have all these expectations weighing on me every single day." "You don't have to figure that out tonight," Mara said gently. "Right now, you just need to rest, and eat, and let yourself heal." They spent the rest of the evening in comfortable silence, Mara occasionally checking on the few other customers scattered through the diner, always returning to sit with Kian, to make sure he was eating enough, resting enough, feeling safe enough within the warm walls of her small establishment. Before he left that night, moving more carefully than usual due to his injuries, Kian turned back at the door, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing me as more than just my failures." "You're not a failure," Mara said firmly. "Don't ever let anyone, including yourself, convince you otherwise." Kian offered a small, genuine smile, the first true smile Mara had seen cross his face since he'd first stumbled through her door soaked from the storm. "I'll try to remember that," he said, before slipping back out into the cool night air, moving slowly down the familiar road toward the ridge and whatever waited for him beyond it. Mara watched him go, her heart heavy with worry, and something else, something that felt suspiciously like the fierce protectiveness a mother might feel for her own child. She didn't fully understand the world Kian belonged to, the traditions that demanded such brutal proof of strength from someone so young, but she understood enough to know that this couldn't continue, that eventually, something would have to change, one way or another. As she closed up the diner that night, locking the door and flipping the sign to closed, she found herself staring toward the dark tree line in the distance, wondering about the man who ruled that hidden world with such absolute, unquestioned authority. Wondering what kind of father could look at a child so clearly desperate for approval, so clearly trying his hardest, despite overwhelming odds, and still find him lacking. Whoever this alpha was, whatever power he held over his people, Mara found herself harboring a quiet, growing anger toward him, an anger she couldn't quite explain given that she had never even met the man. But something told her, deep in her bones, that their paths would cross eventually, that the walls Kian had built so carefully between his two worlds were beginning to crack, and that when they finally shattered completely, nothing would ever be the same again. The bell above the diner door rang sharply on a cold Tuesday evening, and Mara looked up expecting Kian, her usual warm smile already forming. Instead, the smile froze on her lips. The man who stood in the doorway was unlike anyone she had ever seen walk into her small diner. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar, and eyes so intense, they seemed to catch every light in the room and hold it captive. He wore a simple dark jacket, nothing flashy, nothing that should have commanded attention, and yet the moment he stepped inside, the entire diner seemed to shift, conversations dying mid-sentence, forks pausing halfway to mouths, every eye in the room drawn toward him whether they wanted to look or not. Mara felt an instinctive tightening in her chest, some primal warning bell ringing loud and insistent, though she couldn't have explained why. The man's gaze swept across the room methodically, taking in every corner, every face, every exit, before finally settling on her. "I'm looking for a boy," he said, his voice deep and commanding, carrying an authority that made the words feel less like a question and more like a statement of fact that everyone present should already understand. "We get a lot of boys in here," Mara said carefully, keeping her voice steady, despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You'll have to be more specific." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through whatever calm exterior she tried to maintain. Dark hair, he said. Quiet, careful eyes. He would have come here alone, likely after dark. Every instinct Mara possessed screamed at her to protect Keon, to deny any knowledge of a boy matching that description, though the specificity of the man's words told her he already knew far more than he was letting on. Lots of kids pass through here, she said, forcing her voice to remain casual. Truckers' kids, tourists' kids. I don't keep track of every face that walks through that door. Something flickered across the man's expression. Not quite anger, but something close to it, controlled and simmering beneath a surface of practiced composure. I think you know exactly who I'm asking about, he said quietly, taking a slow step closer to the counter. My son has been coming here, regularly, from what I understand. She glanced around the diner, noting the few remaining customers who had gone completely silent, watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes. She needed to get this conversation somewhere more private, somewhere she could speak freely, without an audience. Why don't we talk in my office, she said, nodding toward the small back room she used for paperwork and storage. The man's eyes studied her for a long moment before he nodded once, following her through the swinging door behind the counter. Once inside the small, cluttered space, Mara turned to face him directly, crossing her arms over her chest, in an attempt to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. Who are you? She asked directly. My name is Draven, he said, and the name confirmed everything Mara had feared. This was Keon's father, the Alpha, the man responsible for the bruises, the scars, the desperate hunger for approval that haunted every conversation she'd ever had with his son. You're his father, Mara said, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. I am, Draven said, his gaze steady and unreadable. And I need to know why my son has been sneaking away to visit a stranger's diner in the middle of the night. Maybe because he's hungry, Mara snapped before she could stop herself. Maybe because he's cold and scared and desperate for someone to treat him with basic kindness. Draven's expression shifted, something flickering behind his dark eyes that Mara couldn't quite identify. You've been feeding him. Someone has to, Mara said sharply. He shows up here soaked and shaking, looking like he hasn't eaten properly in days. What kind of father lets his child go hungry? For a moment, Draven's composed mask slipped, revealing something raw and complicated underneath, something that almost looked like guilt before he quickly buried it beneath a more controlled expression. There are things about my world you don't understand, he said carefully. Things that require a different kind of raising than what you might consider normal. Nothing justifies letting a child go hungry, Mara said firmly, or letting him come home with bruises he refuses to explain. Draven's jaw tightened visibly. You've seen his injuries? I've bandaged them, Mara said, more than once. What kind of trials are you putting that boy through? Trials that every child in my position must face, Draven said, though something in his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. It's not something you would understand. Try me, Mara challenged. Draven studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his gaze, as though he were reassessing her entirely, seeing something he hadn't expected to find in a small-town diner owner. My son, he said slowly, carries a burden most children never have to consider. One day, he may be required to lead others, to protect an entire community from dangers you couldn't possibly imagine. That kind of responsibility demands preparation, discipline, strength. And you think hurting him builds that strength? I think, Draven said, his voice hardening slightly, that the world outside these walls is far more dangerous than you realize, and that softness, however well-intentioned, can get a person killed. Mara felt anger rising hot and fierce in her chest. He's a child, she said firmly. Not a soldier, not a weapon. A child who deserves love and support, not fear and pain, disguised as preparation for some destiny he never asked for. Something shifted in Draven's expression again, quick and complicated, gone before Mara could fully identify it. For a long moment he said nothing, simply studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as though he were peeling back layers of her composure to see what truly lay beneath. You care about him, Draven finally said, and it wasn't quite a question. Of course I care about him, Mara said. Anyone with a heart would care about a child as desperate for kindness as your son is. Draven's expression remained unreadable, but something in his posture shifted, a slight easing of tension, that Mara couldn't quite interpret. "I'll need you to stop feeding him information about our world," he said finally. "Whatever he's told you, whatever secrets he's shared, they cannot leave this diner." "I have no interest in your secrets," Mara said honestly. "I only care about his well-being." "Then we have something in common," Draven said quietly, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. He turned toward the door, pausing just before he reached it. "This conversation stays between us. Ikane doesn't need to know I came here." "Why not?" "Because he needs to believe this place remains separate from everything else in his life," Draven said, something almost gentle threading through his otherwise commanding tone. "Whether I approve of his visits here or not, I recognize that he needs something, whatever it is he finds within these walls." Before Mara could respond, Draven had already slipped back through the swinging door, moving through the diner with the same commanding presence that had silenced the room upon his arrival. She watched through the small window as he exited into the night, climbing into a dark vehicle parked just beyond the streetlight's glow, disappearing down the same road Kian always took toward the ridge. Mara stood frozen for several long minutes after he left, her mind racing with everything that had just transpired. She had expected, if she ever met Kian's father, to encounter a monster, someone cruel and heartless, incapable of any redeeming quality. Instead, she had found something far more complicated. A man clearly burdened by responsibilities she couldn't fully comprehend, capable of both harshness and a strange, buried tenderness he seemed determined to hide from the world. Whatever this meant for Kian's future, whatever dangers still lurked in the shadows of his hidden world, Mara understood one thing with absolute clarity. She was now entangled in something far larger than she had ever anticipated, and there was no turning back from the path she now found herself walking. Kian returned to the diner 2 nights after Draven's unexpected visit, unaware that his father had already sat within these very walls, unaware that the secret he'd worked so hard to protect had already unraveled without his knowledge. He slipped through the door with his usual careful glance over his shoulder, settling into their booth with a tired but grateful expression. Mara studied him carefully as she brought over his usual plate, debating internally whether to mention Draven's visit. She had promised the man she would keep the conversation private, but something about hiding information from Kian felt wrong, felt like a betrayal of the trust they'd built together over these past weeks. "Something's different tonight," Kian observed, watching her with those perceptive eyes that seemed to catch every subtle shift in mood or expression. "You seem distracted." Mara sighed, sliding into the seat across from him. "Your father came here," she admitted, deciding honesty was more important than any promise made under pressure. 2 nights ago." Kian's entire body went rigid, his fork clattering against the plate, as his eyes widened with something close to panic. "He came here. What did he say? What did he want?" "He wanted to know why you've been sneaking away to visit a diner," Mara said gently. "He knew about our conversations, Kian. About the food. About everything. How could he know?" Kian's voice trembled slightly, panic clearly rising within him. "I've been so careful. I've never told anyone. I don't think it matters how he found out," Mara interrupted gently. "What matters is what happens now." Kian's hands trembled as he processed this information, his mind clearly racing through possibilities, calculating consequences he feared might follow. "Is he angry? Did he say I would be punished for this?" "He didn't seem angry," Mara said carefully, trying to recall the exact nuances of her conversation with Draven. "Actually, he seemed conflicted. He asked me to stop, but he also said something strange. He said you needed something you find here, and that he recognized that, even if he wasn't sure he approved." Kian stared at her, clearly stunned by this information. "He said that?" "He did," Mara confirmed. "Kian, I think there's more to your father than the strict, harsh figure you've described. I saw something in him, some kind of internal struggle, like he's fighting against expectations even he doesn't fully believe in." Kian shook his head slowly, though something thoughtful had entered his expression. "You don't understand what it's like living under his rules," he said. "Everyone expects him to be strong, unbending, absolute in his authority. If he shows weakness, if he shows softness toward anyone, especially toward me, it could be seen as a sign of vulnerability. Others might try to use that against him, against our entire community." "That sounds like an exhausting way to live," Mara observed. "Never being able to show your true feelings, always maintaining this performance of strength. It's the only way he knows, Kian said quietly. It's the only way any of us know, honestly. Strength is everything where I come from. Weakness gets you hurt, or worse. Mara reached across the table, taking his hand gently. But you're not weak, Kian. Caring about someone, wanting connection, wanting kindness, none of that makes a person weak. If anything, it takes more courage to remain open and caring, in a world that constantly tells you to be hard and closed off. Something shifted in Kian's expression, a kind of dawning realization crossing his young features. I never thought about it that way, he admitted. They sat together quietly for a while, Kian slowly finishing his meal, his mind clearly working through everything Mara had shared. Eventually, he looked up at her with a question that had clearly been building within him. Do you think he could ever be different? Kian asked softly. My father, I mean. Do you think there's any chance he could actually care about me, rather than just seeing me as some kind of test he has to endure? The vulnerability in his voice broke Mara's heart. I think, she said carefully, that people are often more complicated than the roles they're forced to play. Your father might genuinely love you, Kian, even if he's never learned how to show it in ways that feel meaningful to you. How would I even know the difference, Kian asked, between someone who loves me poorly and someone who simply views me as an obligation? Mara considered this question seriously, understanding the weight it carried for a boy who had spent his entire life questioning his own worth in his father's eyes. Maybe, she said slowly, it's less about proving which one is true, and more about deciding what kind of relationship you want to build, regardless of what he's offered so far. You can't control how he feels or how he acts, but you can control how you choose to move forward. Kian nodded slowly, absorbing her words with the same careful consideration he seemed to apply to everything in his complicated life. I've never really thought about having a choice in this, he admitted. It's always felt like something being done to me, rather than something I could actively shape. You have more power than you realize, Mara said firmly, even in a world that constantly tells you otherwise. Their conversation was interrupted by the bell above the door ringing again, and both of them looked up to see a new figure step into the diner, someone Mara didn't immediately recognize. A young woman, perhaps in her late teens, with sharp eyes that swept across the room with the same calculating precision Mara had noticed in Draven during his visit. Kian's entire posture shifted the moment he spotted her, tension flooding back into his frame. That's Lyra, he whispered urgently. She's part of my father's inner circle. If she's here, something's happened. The young woman's eyes found Kian immediately, and she moved toward their booth with purposeful strides, ignoring the curious glances of other customers scattered throughout the diner. Your father needs you, Lyra said without preamble, her voice carrying the same commanding authority Mara had noticed in Draven, though tempered by something that sounded almost like urgency. There's been trouble. Rival factions are making moves against the territory boundaries, and he needs every capable person present for the discussions. Kian's face paled slightly. What kind of trouble? The kind that can't wait, Lyra said firmly. Come now, before things escalate further. Kian glanced back at Mara, worry evident in his expression. I have to go, he said reluctantly. I'm sorry, I don't know when I'll be able to come back. Go, Mara said gently, though worry gnawed at her own chest. Just be careful, whatever this trouble is. Kian nodded, sliding out of the booth and following Lyra toward the door. Just before stepping outside, he turned back one more time, his expression carrying a complicated mixture of fear and gratitude. Thank you for everything, he said quietly, for seeing me as more than just a burden or a test to be passed. Before Mara could respond, he had disappeared through the door, following Lyra into the darkness beyond, leaving Mara standing alone in the diner, with a growing sense of dread settling deep within her chest. Whatever trouble had emerged within Draven's hidden world, she had a feeling it would soon touch her own life as well, whether she was prepared for it or not. 3 days passed without any word from Kian, and Mara found herself increasingly anxious, her mind constantly drifting back to the urgency in Lyra's voice, the fear that had flashed across Kian's face before he disappeared into the darkness. She kept the diner open later than usual each night, hoping against hope that he might appear, even briefly, to let her know he was safe. On the 4th evening, as she was preparing to close, the bell above the door rang, and Mara looked up expecting, hoping, for Kian. Instead, Draven stood in the doorway once again, his expression more troubled than during their previous encounter. "Is Kian all right?" Mara asked immediately, abandoning any pretense of caution. Draven's jaw tightened. "He's safe," he said, though something in his voice suggested this safety had come at a cost. "For now." "What happened?" Draven moved further into the diner, glancing around at the empty tables before settling into a booth, an action that surprised Mara, given his commanding presence during their first meeting. He seemed different tonight, less composed, more burdened by whatever weight he carried. "There are those within my territory who believe my son's perceived weaknesses make our entire community vulnerable," Draven said carefully. "They've been searching for reasons to challenge my authority, to suggest that my leadership has grown soft, that I've failed to properly prepare my heir for the responsibilities he'll eventually inherit." "And they use the fact that he's been coming here as evidence of that?" Mara asked, understanding dawning with cold clarity. "Among other things," Draven confirmed. "They discovered his visits here shortly before I did. Used the information to suggest I've lost control over my own son, that his weakness stems from my failure to properly discipline and prepare him." Mara's stomach twisted with guilt, though she quickly reminded herself that showing kindness to a hungry, frightened child could never truly be considered wrongdoing. "That's not fair to either of you," she said firmly. "Fairness matters little in questions of power and authority," Draven said, though something in his tone suggested even he found this reality exhausting. "What matters is how we respond to challenges against our position." "And how are you responding?" Draven was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying the table between them, as though searching for answers within its worn wooden surface. "I find myself," he admitted slowly, "questioning traditions I've followed, without hesitation, my entire life. Watching my son struggle under expectations I've enforced without truly considering whether they serve any real purpose beyond tradition itself." Mara felt something shift in the air between them, a vulnerability she hadn't expected from someone who projected such absolute authority. "What changed?" she asked softly. "You did," Draven said, meeting her eyes directly. "Your words, when I first came here, they stayed with me longer than I expected. I've spent years telling myself that harshness equals preparation, that pain builds strength. But watching my son grow more withdrawn, more desperate for approval he never seems able to earn, I've begun to wonder if I've simply been perpetuating cruelty disguised as tradition." "That takes courage to admit," Mara said gently. "Or perhaps it simply proves my critics correct," Draven said bitterly. "That I've grown soft, unable to maintain the discipline our community requires." "Or maybe," Mara countered, "it proves you're capable of growth, of recognizing when old patterns no longer serve the people you're supposed to protect. That takes far more strength than blindly following tradition, simply because it's always been done that way." Draven studied her for a long moment, something complicated passing behind his eyes. "You speak as though you understand leadership," he observed. "I understand people," Mara said simply, "and I understand that real strength often looks different than what we're taught to expect. Sometimes strength means admitting when something needs to change, even when that change challenges everything you thought you knew." Draven was quiet again, absorbing her words with the same careful consideration Mara had noticed in Kian, a trait clearly passed down despite the emotional distance between father and son. "The trial I mentioned," he said eventually, "the one my son recently endured. I designed it myself, believing it would prepare him for the challenges ahead. Watching him struggle through it, watching the fear in his eyes as he fought to prove himself worthy, I felt something I haven't allowed myself to feel in years." "What was that?" "The doubt," Draven admitted. "Doubt that I was doing right by him. Doubt that the traditions I've clung to for so long actually serve any true purpose beyond perpetuating unnecessary suffering." Mara reached across the table, an instinctive gesture of comfort despite the complicated circumstances that had brought this powerful, guarded man into her small diner. "It's not too late to change course," she said gently. "For his sake, and honestly, for yours as well." Draven's eyes met hers, something raw and uncertain, flickering behind his usual composed exterior. "The others within my community won't accept change easily," he said. "Tradition runs deep, and challenging it risks destabilizing everything I've worked to maintain. Sometimes," Mara said, "the right choice isn't the easiest one, but that doesn't make it any less necessary." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of everything left unspoken. Finally, Draven nodded slowly, something resolved settling into his expression. "I need to speak with Kian," he said. "Truly speak with him, not simply issue commands or expectations." "That sounds like an excellent place to start," Mara said, offering a small, encouraging smile. Draven rose from the booth, pausing before he reached the door. "Thank you," he said, the words seeming to cost him something significant, as though gratitude wasn't an emotion he expressed easily. "For seeing something in my son that I've struggled to recognize myself, and for challenging me to reconsider paths I've followed blindly for far too long. He deserves someone who sees him clearly," Mara said, "whether that's you, or me, or anyone else who crosses his path." Draven nodded once more, before slipping back out into the night, leaving Mara alone, with a growing sense that something significant had shifted, not just within Kian's hidden world, but within the complicated relationship between father and son that had brought so much pain into a young boy's life. Whatever came next, she sensed that the path forward would not be simple, but perhaps, for the first time, it might finally lead somewhere better. The peace that had begun to settle over the situation shattered abruptly one stormy evening, when the diner door burst open, with far more force than any ordinary customer would use. Mara looked up sharply to see Kian stumbling inside, supported by Lyra, both of them breathing hard, their clothes torn and dirtied, as though they'd been running through the forest for miles. "We need help," Lyra said urgently, her usual composed demeanor completely shattered. "Now." Mara rushed forward, quickly clearing off the nearest booth and helping Lyra ease Kian into the seat. His face was pale, a nasty gash visible along his forearm, and his breathing came in shallow, panicked gasps. "What happened?" Mara demanded, already reaching for the first aid kit she kept behind the counter. "Rival faction," Lyra said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "They learned about the tension within our community, regarding Draven's leadership, saw an opportunity to strike, while things seemed unstable. They ambushed a small group near the northern boundary, Kian included." "Is he seriously hurt?" Mara asked, quickly cleaning the wound on his arm, with careful, practiced movements. "Physically, he'll heal," Lyra said. "But this attack, it's exactly what our enemies wanted. Proof that Draven's leadership has grown weak enough for outsiders to challenge our boundaries without consequence." Kian winced as Mara applied pressure to the wound, but his eyes remained fixed on some distant point, clearly replaying whatever terrifying events had just transpired. "They came out of nowhere," he said shakily. "We were patrolling the boundary, just routine checks, and suddenly they were everywhere, moving faster than anything I'd ever seen." "You're safe now," Mara said firmly, finishing the bandage and squeezing his uninjured hand gently. "That's what matters most right now." "My father," Kian said suddenly, panic flooding his expression. "Is he all right? Was he hurt in the confrontation?" "He's coordinating the response," Lyra said. "He sent me to get you somewhere safe, immediately. Insisted you not be anywhere near the boundary until this situation stabilizes." As if summoned by the mention of his name, the diner door opened again, and Draven strode inside, his expression tight with barely controlled fury and worry combined. His eyes immediately found Kian, sweeping over his injuries with obvious concern, before he crossed the room in quick, purposeful strides. "You're hurt," Draven said, kneeling beside the booth to examine Kian's bandaged arm himself. "I'm fine," Kian said quickly, though his voice trembled slightly. "Lyra got me out before things got worse." Draven's jaw tightened as he studied his son's face, something raw and unguarded passing across his usually composed features. "I should never have allowed you anywhere near that boundary patrol," he said quietly. "This is exactly the kind of danger I feared, the kind of vulnerability our enemies have been waiting to exploit." "I wanted to help," Kian said. "I wanted to prove that I could contribute, that I wasn't just some liability everyone expects me to be." "You are not a liability," Draven said firmly, surprising everyone in the room, including himself, judging by the flicker of shock that crossed his features immediately after the words left his mouth. "You are my son, and your safety matters more to me than any tradition, any expectation, any proof of strength I've demanded from you in the past." Kian stared at his father, clearly stunned by this unexpected declaration. "You've never said anything like that before," he whispered. "I should have said it long ago," Draven admitted, his voice heavy with something that sounded remarkably like regret. "I've spent so many years focused on preparing you for challenges I feared you might face, that I forgot to simply be your father. To make sure you understood that you matter to me beyond whatever role you might eventually fill. The vulnerability in Draven's voice brought tears to Kian's eyes. Tears he no longer seemed to be fighting to hide. I've wanted to hear that my entire life, he admitted quietly. Mara watched this exchange with her heart swelling, grateful to witness this breakthrough between father and son, even as worry about the larger conflict still churned in her stomach. What happens now? She asked, directing the question toward both Draven and Lyra. With this rival faction, I mean. Is the danger over, or just beginning? Draven's expression hardened slightly as he turned his attention back to the larger threat facing his community. This attack was a message, he said grimly. A challenge to my authority, an attempt to expose weakness within our ranks. If we don't respond decisively, they'll continue pushing boundaries, testing how far they can go before facing real consequences. What kind of response are you considering? Mara asked cautiously. A show of unified strength, Draven said. Something that makes clear, our community remains strong, our leadership remains solid, and any challenges to our territory will be met with appropriate consequences. Will that put Kian in more danger? Mara asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. Draven glanced at his son, something protective and fierce flickering behind his dark eyes. Not if I have anything to say about it, he said firmly. Whatever response we mount, Kian remains protected, regardless of what any tradition might demand about heirs proving themselves through combat or confrontation. Kian looked up at his father with something like wonder mixed with disbelief. You're changing the rules? For me? I'm recognizing, Draven said carefully, that some rules perhaps needed changing long before now. Your safety, your well-being, these things matter more than rigid adherence to traditions that may no longer serve their original purpose. Lyra, who had remained quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. The others won't accept this shift easily, she warned, especially not while facing external threats. They'll see any deviation from tradition as further proof of weakness. Then we'll face that challenge when it arises, Draven said firmly. But I won't sacrifice my son's safety or his sense of worth simply to satisfy expectations that have caused nothing but harm. The conversation shifted after that into more practical matters, Draven and Lyra discussing strategy in lowered voices, while Mara continued tending to Kian's injuries, making sure he ate something warm despite his exhaustion and lingering fear. As the evening wore on, the immediate danger seemed to stabilize, though an undercurrent of tension remained, the promise of larger confrontations still looming somewhere on the horizon. Before they eventually left, Draven paused beside Mara, his expression unusually open and vulnerable compared to his typical guarded demeanor. Thank you, he said quietly, for everything you've done, and continue to do, for my son. I see now what I should have recognized far sooner, that kindness, patience, and genuine care matter more than any trial or test I could ever devise. He's a remarkable boy, Mara said honestly. He deserves every bit of kindness the world can offer him. Draven nodded, glancing toward Kian, with an expression that finally, truly, resembled paternal love rather than distant expectation. I intend to make sure he receives exactly that, he said, starting now. The weeks that followed brought significant changes, both within Draven's hidden community and within the quiet rhythm of Mara's diner. Kian's visits continued, though now with an openness that hadn't existed before, his father occasionally accompanying him, the two of them slowly building a relationship neither had thought possible just months earlier. But peace, Mara quickly learned, rarely came without challenges of its own. One evening, as autumn winds rattled the windows and the first hints of winter chill crept into the air, Lyra arrived at the diner alone, her expression grim and urgent. We need to talk, she said, sliding into the booth across from Mara without waiting for invitation. What's happened? Mara asked, immediately setting aside the dish towel she'd been holding. The rival faction, Lyra said. They've grown bolder since our last confrontation. They've discovered Draven's shift in approach toward Kian, his willingness to reconsider traditions long held sacred within our community, and they're using it as ammunition to challenge his leadership more directly than ever before. How serious is this challenge? Serious enough that some are calling for a formal confrontation, Lyra said. A test of leadership, one that could potentially remove Draven from power entirely if he fails to demonstrate sufficient strength and control. Mara's stomach twisted with worry. What would that mean for Kian? If Draven loses his position, Lyra said carefully, Kian's safety, his very place within our community, becomes uncertain. Those seeking to challenge Draven's authority have made no secret of their belief that Kian represents everything wrong with current leadership, proof that our community has grown soft, vulnerable. That's not fair, Mara said fiercely. None of this is his fault. Fairness matters little in questions of power, Lyra said, echoing words Mara had heard from Draven himself weeks earlier. What matters now is how we prepare for whatever confrontation lies ahead. Before Mara could respond further, the door opened and Kian entered, his expression troubled, clearly having overheard some fragment of their conversation as he approached. Is this about the challenge to my father's leadership? He asked directly, settling into the booth beside Lyra. You know about this? Mara asked, surprised. Everyone in our community knows, Kian said grimly. It's been the only topic of conversation for days now. Some believe my father's kindness toward me has made him weak. Others argue that perhaps real strength looks different than what we've always assumed. What do you believe? Mara asked gently. Kian was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I believe, he finally said, that my father has shown more courage in choosing kindness over cruelty than he ever showed in forcing harsh traditions, simply because that's what was expected of him. But I also understand that not everyone will see it that way. So what happens now? Mara asked, looking between Kian and Lyra. There will be a gathering, Lyra explained. All the prominent families within our community, coming together to formally address the challenge against Draven's leadership. It's tradition, going back generations, a way of settling disputes through open confrontation and debate, rather than hidden conspiracy. Will it turn violent? Mara asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. It could, Kian admitted. Though my father hopes to resolve things through demonstrated wisdom, rather than physical confrontation. He believes that if he can show the community that strength comes in many forms, that leadership doesn't require constant cruelty to prove its legitimacy, he might be able to shift perspectives that have remained rigid for generations. And if he can't? Mara asked quietly. Neither Kian nor Lyra answered immediately, the silence itself carrying weight enough to answer the question clearly. When does this gathering take place? Mara finally asked. 3 days from now, Lyra said, at the main gathering hall, deep within our territory. Kian looked at Mara, with an expression that carried both hope and fear combined. My father wants you there, he said unexpectedly. He believes your perspective, as someone entirely outside our traditions, might help others see things differently. Mara blinked in surprise. Me? Why would your community listen to an outsider's opinion on matters of leadership and tradition? Because you're the reason he started questioning everything in the first place, Kian said. Your words, your kindness toward me, despite having no obligation to offer either, challenged assumptions he'd held his entire life. He believes others might benefit from hearing that same perspective. Mara considered this request seriously, understanding the risks involved in stepping so directly into a world she barely understood, a world where she would likely be seen as an unwelcome intrusion by many who valued tradition above all else. But she also understood what was at stake, not just for Draven's leadership, but for Kian's future, his safety, his chance at finally receiving the kind of love and acceptance he'd craved his entire life. I'll come, she said finally, resolve settling firmly into her voice, despite the uncertainty churning beneath the surface. If there's any chance my presence might help protect both of you, I won't hesitate. Relief flooded across Kian's face, followed quickly by fresh worry. It won't be safe, he warned. Some within our community view outsiders with deep suspicion, occasionally with outright hostility. I've faced difficult situations before, Mara said firmly, though privately she felt the weight of genuine fear settling into her chest. Whatever risks this gathering presents, they're worth taking, if it means protecting the people I've come to care about. Lyra studied Mara, with newfound respect evident in her expression. You truly care about him, she observed, nodding toward Kian, beyond simple kindness or charity. He's become important to me, Mara admitted honestly. Both of them have. As the reality of the upcoming gathering settled over the small booth, an unspoken understanding passed between the three of them, a recognition that whatever happened during that confrontation would likely reshape the future for everyone involved, for better or worse. Mara found herself praying silently that her presence, whatever influence it might carry, would be enough to help tip the scales toward mercy, toward genuine strength, built on compassion rather than cruelty, toward a future where Kian could finally exist, without constant fear shadowing every step he took. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, carrying with it the promise of the storm still to come, both literal and metaphorical, as the countdown toward that fateful gathering began in earnest. The gathering hall stood deep within territory Mara had never dared enter before, a massive structure built from ancient timber, hidden among trees so old and towering they seemed to belong to another era entirely. As Draven led her through the entrance, flanked by Kian and Lyra, Mara felt every eye in the crowded space turn toward her, curiosity and suspicion mingling openly on unfamiliar faces. "Stay close," Kian whispered, his hand finding hers briefly for reassurance before the formal proceedings began. The hall fell silent as an older man stepped forward, his weathered features carrying the same commanding authority Mara had noticed in Draven, though tempered by visible age and years of accumulated influence. "Draven," the man addressed formally, "you stand accused of abandoning traditions that have protected this community for generations. Some among us question whether your leadership remains fit to guide us through the dangers we currently face." Draven stepped forward, his posture straight and unwavering despite the obvious pressure of the moment. "I stand here," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the packed hall, "not to defend abandoning tradition entirely, but to argue that tradition itself must sometimes evolve, if it's to continue serving its true purpose, protecting and strengthening our community." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some clearly skeptical, others curious to hear more. The older man gestured for Draven to continue. "For generations," Draven said, "we've believed that strength comes only through hardship, that leadership must be proven through pain and unforgiving trials. I believed this myself, enforced it upon my own son without question, without truly examining whether this approach served any genuine purpose beyond perpetuating suffering that ultimately weakened rather than strengthened those subjected to it." "And what changed your perspective?" a voice called from the crowd, clearly skeptical. Draven's eyes found Mara briefly, before returning to address the assembled community. "A stranger," he admitted, "someone entirely outside our world, showed more genuine strength through simple kindness than any harsh tradition I've ever enforced. She fed my son when he was hungry, listened to him when he was afraid, and offered him unconditional acceptance without demanding he prove himself worthy first." The older man's eyes turned toward Mara, studying her with obvious skepticism. "You believe an outsider's perspective holds relevance to matters of our leadership and tradition?" Mara stepped forward despite the fear churning in her stomach, understanding this moment might determine everything for Kian's future safety and happiness. "I believe," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that true strength isn't measured by how much pain someone can endure, but by how much compassion they can offer, even when circumstances make cruelty easier. Kian has shown remarkable courage, not through winning trials or proving himself through combat, but through his willingness to remain open, caring, and hopeful, despite everything he's endured." Silence stretched through the hall as her words settled over the assembled crowd. Some faces remained skeptical, unconvinced, but others, Mara noticed, seemed to be genuinely considering her perspective, perhaps recognizing truths within her words that resonated with doubts they'd long kept hidden. "This is precisely the weakness we feared," a sharp voice called out, belonging to a tall, severe-looking man who stepped forward from the crowd. "Leadership built on sentiment rather than strength leaves our entire community vulnerable to those who would exploit such softness." "Is it truly weakness?" Draven countered, his voice hardening with conviction, "to recognize that a leader who inspires loyalty through respect and genuine care commands more lasting strength than one who rules purely through fear. My son faced real danger recently, facing enemies who sought to exploit perceived weakness within our ranks. Yet it was his willingness to trust, to seek help rather than face everything alone through misplaced pride, that ultimately kept him alive." Kian, standing beside Mara, straightened his shoulders and stepped forward, surprising everyone, including his own father, with his willingness to speak directly to the assembled crowd. "I've spent my entire life believing I wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy enough, simply because I didn't fit traditional expectations of what strength should look like," he said, his voice trembling slightly, but growing steadier with each word. But I've learned recently that strength comes in many forms. It takes courage to remain kind in a world that constantly demands hardness. It takes strength to ask for help rather than suffering silently. And it takes real leadership to recognize when traditions cause more harm than good, and to have the courage to change course despite resistance. The hall remained quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of Kian's unexpected declaration. Finally, the elderly man who had opened the proceedings spoke again, his expression thoughtful rather than immediately dismissive. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "there is wisdom worth considering in these words. Our community has faced increasing threats recently, and rigid adherence to old ways hasn't necessarily served us better than adaptability might." Draven seized this opening, addressing the crowd with renewed conviction. "I propose," he said, "that we reconsider certain traditions, particularly those surrounding how we prepare and evaluate our young. Strength should still be valued, certainly, but perhaps we can build that strength through support and genuine preparation, rather than unnecessary cruelty disguised as tradition." More murmurs rippled through the crowd, though this time carrying less hostility and more genuine consideration. Slowly, gradually, faces that had appeared skeptical began shifting towards something resembling openness, perhaps recognizing truths within Draven's words that resonated with their own private doubts about traditions long followed without question. The formal debate continued for hours, various community members voicing concerns, questions, and eventually, cautious support for the changes Draven proposed. By the time the gathering finally concluded, though not every voice had been convinced, a significant shift had occurred. Enough support gathered to allow Draven to maintain his leadership while beginning the slow process of reforming traditions that had caused unnecessary suffering for generations. As they finally left the gathering hall, walking together beneath a sky finally clearing after days of storms, Kian turned to Mara with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," he said, "for standing with us today, for having the courage to speak truth to an entire community that could have easily turned against you." "You did the real work," Mara said, squeezing his hand gently. "Your courage in speaking up, in trusting that your voice mattered, that's what truly shifted things today." Draven, walking beside them, offered Mara a look of genuine respect and gratitude. "I don't know how to properly thank you," he admitted, "for everything you've brought into our lives. Not just today, but from the very first night you welcomed my son into your diner, offering him warmth and kindness he'd never known before." "You don't need to thank me," Mara said, smiling warmly. "Watching both of you grow, watching your relationship heal and strengthen, that's more reward than I ever could have expected." As they continued walking together beneath the clearing sky, Mara realized that her small diner had become something far more significant than she'd ever imagined, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed impossibly separate, a place where a frightened, hungry boy had found not just food and shelter, but genuine acceptance and love that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of everyone connected to him. In the months that followed, Kian continued visiting the diner regularly, though now openly, sometimes accompanied by his father, occasionally by other members of their community who had grown curious about the small establishment that had inspired such significant change within their world. Mara found herself embraced by an unexpected family, one built not through traditional bonds, but through genuine care, mutual respect, and the simple, powerful act of choosing kindness, even when circumstances made cruelty easier. And every evening, as the bell above her diner door rang, announcing another visitor stepping through into warmth and safety, Mara smiled, grateful for the unexpected journey that had begun, with one hungry, frightened boy seeking shelter from a storm, and had ultimately led to a future she never could have anticipated, filled with connection, purpose, and the profound realization that sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness can reshape entire worlds.